Good evening, and thanks for joining us where you are for this very special online event hosted by the Science Museum Group. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Bruton, and I'm Curator of Technology and Engineering at the Science Museum London. And I was Curator for the Top Secret exhibition, also here in London, which explored the secret of communications and code breaking, with a particular focus on code breaking in the Second World War. Tonight, I'll be visiting the time period leading up to the Second World War, which is the setting for the brilliant and evocative new book by Chris Bryant MP, The Glamour Boys, The Secret Story of the Rebels Who Fought for Britain to Defeat Hitler. This book explores in exquisite detail the political, social, queer, and personal history around the lives and political work of a group of young, mostly queer British MPs known as the Glamour Boys in the 1930s. These queer British politicians visited the more sexually permissive Germany throughout the 1930s, where they witnessed the rise of Nazism and the brutality of Hitler's Germany, including the introduction of concentration camps, up close as the Nazis arrested their gay and Jewish friends. At a time when even the suggestion of homosexuality could land you in prison, it took extraordinary courage for them to speak out against the British government's policy of appeasement, to argue for the British rearmament in the late 1930s, and to oppose anti-Semitism in British society and politics at that time. This group of extraordinary young men put their careers, their privacy, and their very lives on the line. We've just seen some images of some of the key protagonists in the story, the MPs Jack McNamara, Ronald Cartland, Victor Cazalet, Robert Bernays, and the intelligence officer, Sir Joseph Ball, who we will be discussing in detail tonight. This is the part of Open Talks events exploring the causes and effects of societal discrimination, the first of which took place in September last year when Science Museum Group Director Sir Ian Blatchford was joined by Labour MP David Lammy. More Open Talks events will be announced in due course, so keep an eye out on our website for details of those. But let's return to tonight, where I'm delighted to be here with Sir Ian and the author of the brilliant Glamour Boys, Chris Bryant, who is a Welsh Labour MP politician, Labour Party politician who has served as MP for Rhondda since 2001. He's held a variety of positions in both the Cabinet and Shadow Cabinet, and is author of several previous books, has written articles for The Telegraph and The Guardian, and has appeared on just about every major TV and radio, news and current affairs programmes you can think of. He was the first gay MP to celebrate his civil partnership in the Palace of Westminster. Chris is the chair of the Standards and Privileges Committee. Welcome, Chris. Thanks to you both for joining us. And before we get started, I'd like to point out there you can buy a signed copy of the book by clicking the link to Chris's website in the description below, with all proceeds going to the Rhondda Calendar Society. We'll also be taking some of your questions live via the chat box function, which will reopen later into the conversation. If you do have trouble posting, please try refreshing your page. And without further ado, good evening to both of you. And Ian, perhaps you'd like to get us started.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Liz, and thank you, Chris, for spending time with us. And the reason we have this series is we're fascinated by how much history is still untold. And as I think I said to you when I first read the book, I thought I knew the history of British politics in the 1930s very well. But I have a view which I think is a standard view, which is that in the run-up to the Second World War, that Churchill alone was the man who spoke out against appeasement, all part of the mythology, to some degree accurate, about Churchill in the wilderness years. And I want to start with two very different questions. And the first is, I have a question about inspiration and then a question about method. And can you tell us a little bit why you decided to write it? Because there's a very beautiful image at the start of the book about memorial shields next to the speaker's chair. And I wonder if you could say something about that and why you decided this book needed to be written.
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me. I think probably Churchill would have agreed with the argument that it was basically all down to Churchill as well. And of course, he got to write the books, the history books, because he survived, whereas many of the people that we're talking about here didn't survive. They were killed in action in brave circumstances in the war. So there were two things that stimulated me to get interested in the story. The first was I came across, when I was writing a history of Parliament a few years ago, I came across this guy called Jack McNamara. He was a colonel in the London Irish Rifles. He served in India. He was Conservative MP for Chelmsford from 1935 until his death in 1944. And I read this sentence about him which said that he had gone on sex tours to Nazi Germany to see some of his Nazi friends, along with Guy Burgess, who was later revealed to be a Soviet spy, his lover, a married Anglican Archdeacon, Herbert Sharp. And they had met up with all sorts of senior figures, both in Germany and then in France. And on one occasion, they'd even played table tennis using a strapping young cyclist who was naked as the table tennis net. And I was kind of intrigued by that sentence. Now, lots of the elements of that story turned out not to be quite right, though lots of them bizarrely are true. And then I worked out that Jack was one of the MPs who was killed in action in the Second World War. So at the back of the chamber of the House of Commons, behind the Speaker's chair, there's a series of little shields. Some of them are very colourful. They are family shields, armorial bearings. And some of them just have letters in gold on blue. So, for instance, for Jack, it's JRJM, Jack Robert Jermaine McNamara. And these are to commemorate each of the MPs who were killed in service in the Second World War. They were put up there at Churchill's insistence because when Victor Cazalet was killed in an airplane crash, along with General Sikorsky, the leader of the Free Poles during the Second World War, to whom Victor was acting as kind of British liaison officer. When he was killed, Churchill was so upset and moved that he decided that when the chamber was rebuilt, he would put these shields up commemorating all the MPs who'd been killed in the war. And it's just really striking that of the 23 that there are, at least 4, if not 5, maybe 6 were gay men.
Fascinating.
And that's a bit of the story that you know nobody's ever known.
Yeah. And just dwelling on the fact that these men were gay, the other thing I want to ask, this is very much a museum director question. I'm in the middle of doing some research for a biography of a great 19th century politician and scientist, and I'm overwhelmed with material because his loving wife and children kept all his papers. But Chris, what's interesting, you had exactly the opposite experience. I think, can you say something about the fact that actually the people you were writing about, their history was censored by their own families?
So I'd come across Jack McNamara and I'd researched him, but when he died, he left all his estate to his brother, but his brother was so angry at his brother's homosexuality that he refused to inherit from him. Though interestingly, Jack's brother's descendants have been extraordinarily helpful to me, and they say they are phenomenally proud now of having a brave gay ancestor. Researching the others, I was very worried that I wasn't going to find enough hard fact evidence, like letters, because at the time it was a criminal offence not just to commit their words, sodomy or buggery, but to attempt to do so, which meant that you could be sent to prison with hard labour for 2 years, and possibly even with lashing, simply for writing a letter to another man, or for meeting a man in a bar and going home with them. And so I was very worried that there wouldn't be any documentary evidence around at all. But actually, I wrote it originally as a fictional book, and then we didn't manage to sell that. It didn't go very well. I'm not very good at fiction, I think. And I delved further, and I just by pulling at the little strands here and there, I found more and more. And I ended up telling the McNamara family stories that they'd never heard before, and that I could prove because, for instance, in the Tate Gallery archive, there are the diaries of an artist called Arthur Lett Haynes, who lived with his lover Cedric Morris for many years. Arthur Lett Haynes helped get Jack McNamara out of prison when Jack got into trouble in a kind of dodgy sexual adventure in Tunisia in 1926. And there was loads in there about the parties that they held, about how Ivor Novello came round for dinner and things like that. And sometimes previous historians had deliberately expurgated parts of the story. So in Eton College Library, there are letters from Victor Cazalet, or to Victor Cazalet from Gottfried von Cramm, which were used by a previous biographer, but in a very expurgated way, because it didn't make any reference to the fact that Gottfried von Cramm got into trouble in 1937, was a famous German tennis player. He lost the Wimbledon final in 1935 to Fred Perry, in 1936 to Don Budge, was expected to win 1937, was arrested because he had a lover who was not only a man, but Jewish to boot. The previous biographers have referred to the letters, but never referred to the fact that Gottfried was thanking Victor Cazalet for getting his lover out of Germany to originally Portugal and then to Palestine. So sometimes I've had to read between the lines and then just pull at a fact until you get the harder fact. I found Robert Bernays' family because both his sons, Robert and Richard, are directors of companies, so Companies House had their addresses, and they let me have all their letters, all Robert's letters, his love letters, Tiff, who he married in the Second World War, and also his handwritten diary from his trip to Australia in 1930 with the Earl of Beauchamp, just before the Earl of Beauchamp was hounded out of society for being gay.
Actually, the Earl of Beauchamp is a particularly wonderful section because there's a story which may well be true, that when the King discovered that Lord Beauchamp, the Governor General of New South Wales, was gay and had been sleeping with his butler, he famously, I think, said to his private secretary, surely he should shoot himself. I mean, one of the great things about the book, which we don't quite have time to talk about now, but I think you capture so brilliantly, is the kind of jeopardy of gay men. And actually, the interesting thing in the book, Chris, is that rank, privilege, money was no protection. That actually quite random in terms of actually how fate would treat you if you were a gay man.
Well, I mean, Nancy Astor, who was, of course, famously the first British woman MP to take her seat in the House of Commons, her son, by her first marriage, Bobby Gould Shaw, who was a stunningly handsome man, according to all the people of the day, and according to the portraits of him as well, he was caught twice, and on the first occasion with other men, and on the first occasion he was given an ultimatum to resign his commission in the army or else face prosecution. He resigned his commission. The second time he was caught, the ultimatum was leave the country or face prosecution, and he decided to face prosecution because he didn't want to live in exile for the rest of his life, which was brave. But he spent 6 months in prison with hard labour. He was fortunate because there was some protection for him, because Nancy Astor's husband owned one set of newspapers, her brother-in-law owned another set of newspapers, and she had various other friends that she could lean on, including Lord Beaverbrook, who kept everything out of the newspapers. That wasn't true for others, and people faced complete social ostracism, and it was a terror for them. So you had to be enormously careful about, you could crack jokes about Nancy's and young men and things like that, but you could never, ever, ever let anybody know the real facts and the truth.
So one of the things that is kind of the central part of the book is the this group and its relationship with Chamberlain. But obviously a lot of the book is about different views about the degree of menace and danger from Hitler. But also you make a very important point in the book early on, which I don't want to overlook, because for me it was really fascinating, because you get the mental world of the 30s. Both Chamberlain and the guys who appear in your book were in some sense flying blind. And what I mean is that you as a modern politician, you are overwhelmed by public opinion polls every day. We know what the public think on every issue of every hour. And one of the things you say in the book is that actually, in a way, the world of the politician in the 1930s is quite a claustrophobic one, that actually there isn't public opinion. Can you say something about that? Because I'd never really thought about that before.
Well, in a sense, I draw a parallel to Twitter today, because MPs might think they know what the public is thinking, but they probably only know what the people that they follow on Twitter are thinking most of the time, especially in this last year when you've not been able to go out and door knock. But it's even more true, of course, in the 1920s, 1930s, because the only way you had of gauging public opinion was reading newspapers or going to rallies of the faithful. And, well, as Jeremy Corbyn found, you can have rallies of lots and lots of people shouting their support for you. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to vote for you. And most British politicians in the 1930s, even though they didn't know for certain what the public thought, they believed that the vast majority of people were completely opposed to another war. They wanted to do everything they possibly could to avoid another war. And they thought that it was political suicide for anybody to be arguing that we had to rearm to fight Germany again, even when it was absolutely plain that Hitler was a danger. And I guess one of the things that motivated me about writing the book was that everybody thinks that Churchill was the first person and the only person to make this argument that we had to rearm and see off Hitler. Actually, Churchill wasn't very good on Franco in Spain, and he wasn't very good on Mussolini in Italy either. He rather admired both of them. But more importantly, the people I'm writing about, like Rob Bernays, he went to Germany in 1932 and was there for some of the key moments. And Bob Boothby, likewise, who was at least bisexual. And they wrote very, very clearly when they got back to the UK that Britain had to beware. Now, each of the people I write about have their own personal journey during this period. So Jack McNamara, for instance, certainly at the beginning of the 1930s, wanted a rapprochement with Germany. He thought Germany was a vibrant new country, should be released from the shackles of the Versailles Treaty. He went to Germany in 1936 to celebrate the remilitarization of the Rhineland, which was breaking the Versailles Treaty. But he also visited Dachau. And at Dachau, he will have seen not just political prisoners, communists and members of the Social Democratic Party, but Jews in large numbers and homosexuals in large numbers. And he saw the violence and wrote about it, was horrified, and came back, and from that moment onwards was dedicated to fighting Hitler. Likewise, Harold Nicholson, who was married to Vita Sackville-West, they were both gay, had many affairs, both of them, and Harold, personal friends of his, were arrested in Germany, were actually there as part of the Night of the Long Knives when Hitler killed off all the early gay Nazis. And it was a personal awakening for them, each of them having their own process of getting to this point. Perhaps Victor Kazel at the last, and for him it was the seizing of Czechoslovakia and the Anschluss with Austria, and people begging him in the street, rich people begging him in the streets of Austria as Jews, saying, please, please, please take me back to Britain, because only in Britain will I be safe.
Let me a quick comment to Liz. But Liz, I'm going to come to you in a minute about Joseph Ball, because I want to stay with the vein of where Chris is, because I think the book is so fascinating in terms of, with the exception of Robert Bernays, what you capture is basically almost the entire British establishment quite aroused by 1933, if I can put it that brutally. I mean, Victor Cazalet is, Rob Bernays is the exception, because there's a wonderful phrase that you quote where he says that most of the British establishment thought that Hitler was a jolly scoutmaster on an outing. And it was only Bernays who actually heard the speeches and realised the menace. Cazalet for me is the most extraordinary story, Chris, because he went to Dachau as a kind of recreational thing, but later in his life is one of the greatest champions for the creation of Israel. So, he starts the story, as indeed many of your characters, if I can put it bluntly, like Jack McNamara, they're pretty right-wing politicians who go on a pretty amazing journey in a few years, don't they?
Yes, it's interesting. We've not mentioned Ronnie Cartland yet, and it's intriguing, isn't it, that Barbara Cartland, that kind of vision of pink meringue, as she was in later life, who wrote all those romance novels. In the 1930s, she was the best person. She ran amazing parties. You always wanted to get invited to her rather saucy, naughty, celebrated parties and appear in her gossip column. And her younger brother, Ronnie, was elected in 1935, never had much money. The family had fallen on hard times. He was also a conservative, but his first rebellion was over financial support from the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Neville Chamberlain, to depressed areas like the Rhondda, where I am now. And interestingly, the other person who rebelled with him was Jack McNamara. So even amongst this, they were heavily imperialistic. They were very Tory. They all signed up for as police assistants in the general strike and so on. But Jack McNamara was also very brave in defying his own party over the Spanish Civil War and trying to protect the children of Basque refugees, whom the British government under Stanley Baldwin just didn't want to accept in the UK. Baldwin's argument, incidentally, was that the weather in Britain wouldn't be any good for young Basques. He obviously didn't understand that the weather in the Basque country is pretty much the same as it is in the Rhondda.
I want to go now to Liz, because I want to talk about the real formation of the Glamour Boys, the central theme in the book, and also a character I know Liz has become slightly obsessed with, which is Joseph Ball. Liz, over to you, because this is a really interesting story.
I sort of have to ask a cheeky question first. Do you think Barbara Cartland would have made a better MP than her brother? Because it really does sound like she might have.
Well, she worked hard on his behalf. She basically prostituted herself to get him the seat in the first place by going to a castle in Scotland and enticing this rather dodgy, lecherous old Tory MP round to her bedroom, which was in a far part of the castle, and then saying, actually, what I wanted to talk to you about wasn't anything amorous, it was brother, and whether you'd help him get selected to be the Tory MP in one of the Birmingham seats. No, I don't think she would have been a better MP. Ronnie was pretty courageous. At some of the key moments in the debates in the Commons, it's Ronnie who maybe slightly loses his temper, but in a strategic way, and shocks everybody into realizing the situation that they're facing. And he got people calling him a traitor, saying he should be hanged. They tried to get him deselected, but basically he knew that we would have to fight Germany. And even though he had a shooting accident in his leg when he was at school at Charterhouse, and then he'd managed to have his ankles shorn off on a motorcycle ride in London, he nonetheless forced himself, as it were, past the medical to join the Royal Artillery and fought very bravely at Dunkirk.
Wonderful. So let's introduce, Joseph Ball. Let's introduce Joseph Ball.
We've heard a little bit about the sort of the political, national and international enemies of these sort of glamour boys, but the figure that you are particularly focused on in this book is Joseph Ball, who's sort of the villain of the piece, if one could say so. Not to give away too much to maybe those who haven't read the book, but he's an ex-MI5 intelligence officer, working class background, which is one of the few working class background characters in this book. And he makes a very easy transition from life as an intelligence officer through to sort of running sort of press intelligence operations for the Conservative Party in the 1920s and 1930s, creating these sort of back channels with fascists in Italy and Germany for Neville Chamberlain. Can you tell us a bit more about that tension between Chamberlain, Joseph Ball and the Glamour Boys and where that goes?
So basically, the 1935 general election delivered a massive majority for the national government under Stanley Baldwin, and then Stanley Baldwin gave way as leader of the Conservative Party and leader of the government to Neville Chamberlain in 1937. So Neville Chamberlain has a majority of more than 225 seats in the House of Commons over all the others. He has a very strong whipping organisation. He's very determined. He believes that by the force of his own personality, he will persuade Hitler and Mussolini to back down on all of their territorial ambitions. And that's what leads to the Munich agreement and all the rest of it. But he likes a bit of a back channel, and he is very close to this man, Sir Joseph Ball, who was knighted by Baldwin for his services to the party. And Chamberlain uses Joseph Ball to set up a black operation, a secret black ops unit, which was deliberately aimed at undermining all of Chamberlain's opponents, both within the Conservative Party and outside it. It ended up spending more time on those inside the Conservative Party because that's where the majority of MPs were. And so he does two things. First of all, he deliberately undermines Anthony Eden, who's the Foreign Secretary, and forces him effectively to resign at the beginning of 1938. And when Anthony Eden resigns, maintains that it's all because he spreads rumours about through his network of sort of crony journalists that first of all that Anthony Eden has a mental health problem. He's had a nervous breakdown, and secondly, he starts using this term for the people who surround Anthony Eden of the glamour boys, and the term is meant to be deliberately nasty. It's meant to insinuate something, because the word glamour today is not what it was back in the 1930s. In the 1930s, it meant a spell that was cast by a witch, by a woman. It's fundamentally effeminate and wrong, immoral and dangerous, insidious. So that he was deliberately suggesting something about the men who were surrounding Anthony Eden. And of course, it was an easy target because Ronnie Cartland, Jack McNamara, Rob Bernays, Harry Cruikshank, Philip Sassoon, all the people, Jim Thomas, all the people who surrounded Anthony Eden basically were gay or queer or nearly queer. I use the word queer not because I want to get into the whole kind of queer studies thing, but simply because the word gay is an anachronism, of course, for then. Even the word homosexual is, and certainly the word bisexual is an anachronism which they wouldn't have understood. Whereas at least the word queer was around, albeit in a pejorative sense back then.
Can I just dive in, Liz, with a little supplementary, if I may, just because the other thing that fascinated me in the book is you say something which the audience listening will not believe could ever have been true, that one of the big anxieties in Britain in the 1930s was depopulation. Too many people were leaving to go and run the empire. And there was a big campaign in the press writing to single male MPs saying, "Why are you not married?" I mean, this was a gift, wasn't it, to Joseph Ball to really start a bullying campaign?
Yes, and the word bachelor was a bit of had a bit of a sting to it. And so if you had a journalist ringing up and saying, "Why are you still a bachelor?" or write articles about why, about you as a bachelor, it sort of insinuated something as well. And I think people, Ronnie Cartland and Rob Bernays would have got very nervous about this. And I mean, even when I told my mother that I was gay, I remember her biggest fear was, and I think nearly every gay man has been told this, I'm not sure whether gay women get told this as well, but, "Oh, you'll be lonely in your old age." And that was a really powerful feeling for lots of men in this period. They were terrified that they would be lonely in their old age. And so lots of them got married. And sometimes that led to terrible, terrible bitterness and unhappiness. As for Sir Paul Latham, who was married, a big society wedding, was caught with 3 gunners in the Second World War and tried to commit suicide when it was all discovered.
Liz, back to you. Sorry to interrupt you.
I mean, sort of as a related question, I mean, I can understand the difficulty of the lives that they lived and the hard choices, even the use of the word choices. Maybe they didn't feel like they had a choice. But I mean, did you ever get a sense of how their wives felt about this? Because it's possible that they signed up to marriage not necessarily knowing quite what they were signing up for. I mean, we do get a few female voices in this, but yeah. I mean,
I'm sorry. It is a problem with the book that there aren't all that many female voices. Though interestingly, Ronnie Cartland was very close to Barbara, and they spoke to each other at least twice a day. And Victor Cazalet's sister, Thelma Cazalet, was an MP. and fierce defender of Victor, and absolutely denied that he was gay. I think her arguments fall apart fairly quickly, but anyway. And Rob Bernays wrote diary letters to his sister, who was living in Brazil at the time, on a daily basis. So a lot of them had women in their lives. There were clearly, the relationship between Harold Nicolson and Vita Sackville-West was a very loving one, I think. Though their children, I think, had more difficulty accommodate, when they learnt the truth of it all, found it more difficult to comprehend.
Yeah, I just need to sort of interject and say that our chat box is now open, so people can put questions in the chat box to Chris and Ian, and this is our live chat box, and we will be answering questions in about 10 or 15 minutes. If you're having problems with the chat box, press refresh, and that should get it working.
Liz, can I dive in with another question just to Chris? The problem is, you can tell Liz and I are competing because, Chris, we love your book. I mean, there's so many interesting stories. And also, I mean, give an example. There's a very interesting relationship between outsiders. So the relationship between the Jewish community and the gay community, fascinating interrelationship. But also, what I really want to ask you is that one of the things that made life easier for Joseph Ball and Chamberlain, which I think we should be really upfront about, we obviously focus very much on anti-Semitism in Germany, but good grief, the evidence in your book for the occasions when the Glamour Boys spoke about the plight of the Jews, before and after Kristallnacht. I mean, let's be honest, that they received hostility and the British press was overwhelmingly indifferent. I mean, your book is unsparing in its evidence.
Well, and I've found it particularly depressing reading all of this in the last couple of years when, anti-Semitism has been very virulent in British politics today. But it's true, when the Night of the Long Knives happened in 1934, this is when Hitler gathered all the leaders of the stormtroopers who he knew to be gay. He got them all to come together and basically arrested about 130 of them and had them all executed over a very short weekend. Lots of them were gay. The British newspapers, including the Times, reported that Hitler was just cleaning up and that it was rather overdue. That's not how, obviously, the characters that I'm writing about saw this. And similarly, lots of the abuses of the Jews from 1932 onwards in Germany were rather dismissed by lots of people in British politics as rather irrelevant. Some people some horrible aristocrats would argue that the Jews had it coming, that it was all their own fault. So the idea that we went to war because we were a morally minded country and Germany was terribly anti-Semitic is a nonsense. In fact, Rob Bernays' father was a vicar in Finchley, but his his forebears were Jewish, including a rabbi in Germany, and relations who were both the wife and lover of Sigmund Freud. But he was attacked when he was in Germany by Hitler's allies for being a Jew, and had sometimes his posters during general elections were covered up with things saying Jew on them. Likewise, Philip Sassoon, who was a wealthy government minister, minister for aircraft production, I think almost certainly gay, spent a lot of time with an awful lot of men anyway. His house was daubed with the words "Perish Judah," which was one of the anti-Semitic fascist campaign slogans of the time. Sir Joseph Ball, rather, when he purchased a magazine secretly called, ironically enough, the magazine Truth, deliberately to spout material attacking the Glamour Boys and anybody who was opposed to Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasing Hitler. And the rank anti-Semitism in it is just extraordinary. just
Can
extraordinary.
can I just dwell on that, Chris, for a minute? Because I think Liz and I were both very struck by the fact that for the Glamour Boys, I mean, in speaking out in favour of the rights of Jews, they were sort of breaking some of the rules of their kind of club, weren't they? I mean, there's a story in the book. Can we just dwell on it? Because actually, I was so shocked by it, I had to put the book down for a bit. There's a story of one of your Glamour Boys who gives a big speech defending the position of Jews in the House of Commons, and then goes to dinner at the Carlton Club. And I mean, you know how that story ends. I mean, it's just in itself a terrible story.
And he's spat at and called
Yeah.
a Jew lover, which I think is a double insinuation, incidentally. But I don't think that was. And his speech was the mild. I mean, he was just saying that he thought that Jew baiting, his term, was un-British. And it's the mildest speech of all. But the other person who speaks in that debate, and even more forcibly, is the only female Glamour Boy, the Duchess of Athol, Catherine Stewart, who was an amazing woman, and she, because Chamberlain is so angered by this group of people that he sets every behind-the-scenes group on to root out stories about them. Their phones are tapped. Ronnie Tree knows his phone is tapped. They get followed. They get nasty stories appearing in the newspapers. And their local Tory associations are wound up to oppose them. And she's so fed up with this policy of appeasement that she stands at the end of 1938. She resigns from the Commons, stands in a by-election, to give Neville Chamberlain a bloody nose. But unfortunately, the Tory whips forbid any of the Glamour Boys from helping her in her campaign, and she narrowly loses her seat.
Liz, before we go to questions, can I just draw one other thing in the book, but is that also, I don't know whether you planned it, but there's also a wonderful kind of surreal humour in the book, which is somehow very British. So all these people who are campaigning, whilst they're worrying about the future of Europe, they're all having lunch at the Savoy. There's also this wonderful bit in the book when the greatest warning sign of all is when Russia and Germany sign their peace deal before in 1939, and Chamberlain's very annoyed about having to come back to the House of Commons because he's fly fishing in Scotland. And there's also a wonderful thing in the book where the biggest press story in the summer of 1939 is not Hitler, it's that the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough have had a great ball for their daughter. I mean, the thing that I think we both felt is there's this wonderful comment. It's kind of surreal. I mean, it's a wonderful insight into the establishment of the 30s.
I tried to do as much as possible was give an impression of the social world in which people lived as well. So, I've written probably more extensively than anybody about the Turkish baths in London, because that was the safest place for men to have sex in London. It wasn't controlled by the police. It was controlled by the local authorities, and who tended to have a rather, cast a blind eye over it. And it's quite clear that sometimes people said that they'd been to the Savoy last night, and allowing people to think they'd been to dinner at the Savoy Grill or stayed at the hotel, when in actual fact they'd been having a bit of a rub down at the Savoy Turkish baths. Where you could hire a bachelor suite for the night, and I tried to give a bit of what was fascinating to me was how much Noel Coward turns up, and Ivor Novello, and so on. They were very much in this political milieu as well. And there's this great moment when Neville Chamberlain is making his speech after the Munich Pact, where he's basically given Hitler Czechoslovakia disgracefully, and he thinks it's peace with honour. All the Glamour Boys are furious; they call it peace with dishonour. Ivor Novello is rather impressed by the speech and starts crying, whereupon Noel Coward punches him very hard, and he says that that what Neville Chamberlain has just discovered is the joy of the applause of the chorus boys. And so, it's a very live environment. They're going to dinner together frequently. They are a social group. They meet regularly. They meet as a political group as well. And sometimes they have their little political meetings where they plot what they're going to do to try and undermine Chamberlain's policy of appeasement. And then they go off to dinner at Boulestin, which, of course, was run by Michel Boulestin, the famous gay French restaurateur who'd written a rather naughty book called Maurice, Les Fréquentations de Maurice, which was published in France but couldn't be published in England.
So I'm going to use Chair's privilege to ask the final question before we open up to questions in the chat. I really must ask, I mean, it's such a fascinating, detailed book about their disparate activities in the House of Commons, in the Turkish baths, in continental Europe. But can you tell us a little bit more about perhaps, the achievements of the Glamour Boys? Were there particular votes you could point to, or were their achievements more about changing the tone of the conversation in the House of Commons and more broadly?
Well, I mean, as an MP, I think I've written about events in the Commons in a different way from maybe others have, because I know the what it feels like, the drama of the moment in that building, and also I was very fortunate to have some of the first-hand reports from the Glamour Boys themselves that have never been used anywhere else before. So giving a new impression of events that have been written about elsewhere before. And the fact that in the mood in the Commons can turn on a sixpence, and I try to give an impression of the drama as it unfolds. Sometimes politics seems very undramatic, but actually it was very dramatic. And I think often they were the linchpin in those moments when the chamber turned on its heel, turned on a sixpence, the fact that they weren't participating in the hoops of joy after Munich, it was noted by everybody. The fact that they abstained on significant motions, or the fact that Ronnie Cartland, at one of the key debates in August, a debate on whether the House should go into recess, a bit like the debate in 2019 about whether Parliament should be illegally prorogued by the Prime Minister. In other words, whether Parliament should be suspended for the summer, when the Glamour Boys felt this was going to be the key moment. They feared that Chamberlain was going to do another surrender to Hitler. This time it would be Poland. The Glamour Boys wanted Parliament to sit. They were Tory MPs. Chamberlain turns it into a motion of no confidence, or confidence in him personally. And yet they still refused to vote for him. That's the kind of moment when you knew that the writing was on the wall for Chamberlain's policy, because of what they've done. And in the end, I know it might seem an exaggeration, because it wasn't only them, but without them, there wouldn't have been a nucleus of people campaigning for Britain to rearm and to end the policy of appeasement. And Hitler would have carried on his merry way.
Fascinating. Thank you very much. So we've got our first question here from Samina, who says, great discussion about these young, brave men, and it's great that you've published this book, but would you ever do a documentary or radio program to share this story? And I have to admit, I would add an amendment to this. Have you thought about selling it as a drama series to Netflix or BBC?
So there is a company who bought the rights to turn it into a miniseries, yes, and I mean, I really hope that happens, because I just think it would be beautiful and very moving. Quite often when I tell the story, especially when I get onto what happened in the Second World War and their own personal struggles during the war, I feel very close to tears, because their heroism has not been recognised for so many decades, and so many people think of it's well known gay men can't catch a ball, can't shoot a gun, is never brave. Even Bob Boothby, one of the people I write about, says that gay men are not capable of sustained fortitude. So part of the reason for wanting to write the book was to smash those stereotypes.
Yeah. So we've got a sort of a question here from Pippa, which is, given how well documented this period is, it's remarkable that stories like this are only just coming to light. What other hidden or buried parts of this period of history will be uncovered next, do you think? Or maybe this is your next book, I don't know.
Well, no, I hope my next book is going to be about a period a bit earlier, actually, 1835. But no, I think it was by chance that I landed on this piece of history, and of course it always is by chance that you land on something. There's such a joy when you find something that nobody else has come across before. Well, you must know as a curator, when you're explaining something for the first time to people and giving it a new patina. There's an immense joy about that, and I'm just delighted that so many people have been so kind about it. And we've never managed to have a book launch, but we might manage to have a book launch for the paperback in July.
Brilliant, brilliant. And I mean, do you think I know your next book isn't about this, but do you think there are other sort of hidden or buried stories about this, or perhaps other queer servicemen who fought in the Second World War whose lives are a little less well known or celebrated?
Yes, there's a book which was, I think, self-published about gay servicemen, and there were lots of heroes, Hector Bolitho, Ian Gleed. I mean, there are quite a lot.
It was called.
But
Was that the book Proud Service, or so? It had. I remember. I think I read it.
Out and Proud, isn't it? I think, or
I thought it was called.
I'm looking behind me because I know it's up there somewhere.
I think I had a copy. It was very good. It was about gay men who fought in the First and Second World War, which I quite enjoyed. Quite a sort of complementary book to yours in many ways. So we have a question from Lillian, which was, I was wondering, do you each have a glamour boy that you're particularly attached to or that you particularly liked?
I think I fancy Jack McNamara.
Who doesn't?
There's a, I mean, he was the naughtiest of the lot. And incidentally, I know I'm making this sound all terribly, terribly serious, the whole book and stuff. I hope there's quite a bit of humour in it as well. Yeah. Because... for instance, Victor Cazalet set up an anti-aircraft battery in Sevenoaks in the Second World War, and he recruited, because he was quite wealthy. He was a director of the Dorchester. He did all of the recruiting for it at the Dorchester, where he would invite young men to dinner. And a lot of the men who managed to get into his anti-aircraft battery were either writers or architects, including the architect, incidentally, of the National Theatre, but also gay. And it got known as the Monstrous Regiment of Gentlemen, or the Buggers Battalion. Indeed, it had such a reputation as that one former Conservative MP who'd been in the army, when trying to persuade his son-in-law that he shouldn't join this anti-aircraft battery, had to ask his wife and daughter to leave the room before explaining to him that it was the Buggers Battalion. And likewise, McNamara's regiment seems to have been very warm and welcoming towards gay men as well.
I just have to ask make a little comment, Chris, at that point, is that once war is declared, there's a wonderful thing which perhaps you can explain to our listeners, what the pink sink was at the Ritz.
Yes, so the Ritz had set up an underground basement bar and dressed it up as a kind of dugout, and it was known as l'abri du Ritz, the shelter or the Ritz shelter, and it was almost entirely gay clientele, and there's plenty of stories of people having a very lively time there, and fairly camp, and and generals and government ministers and all sorts meeting young gentlemen and sometimes taking them home there. And Paul Latham, indeed, the MP I referred to earlier, that was one of the places that he used to go to. And there were other places as well. I think it's called the Arts and Battle Dress. Various other bars that arose in the Second World War, because ironically enough, the blackout gave various opportunities for sexual encounters, and being away from home in an entirely male environment, likewise. And there's some suggestion that the armed forces didn't really mind, because in the end you were gun fodder, which is a depressing fact. But Jack McNamara was desperate to lead his troops into battle. he'd risen to be colonel of the London Irish Rifles in 1938, and he'd been busily recruiting into a second line as well, fastest recruiting of any regiment in the UK. But Pug Ismay at the War Office resolutely refused to give him a command anywhere near danger. He kept on having sort of semi-policing jobs on the south coast or in Ireland. And it wasn't until 1944 that he ended up in the Adriatic as sort of part of the staff behind the Special Boat Service. And then he was killed when he was visiting his former troops, as it were, who were advancing on the River Senio.
And Ian, what about you? Do you have a favourite glamour boy?
I think Victor Cazalet, because my goodness, he's so good looking, but also because his journey is so extraordinary. I mean,
you're so shallow, Ian.
I confess, but no, I think also, I mean, you mentioned it earlier, but actually, I think you undersell the extraordinary point in the book where this is a man who visits Dachau as a holiday activity in 1933, and then in just before the war, he's visiting Czechoslovakia. And he's surrounded by Jewish people, and also refugees from Austria, begging him to take them back to England to be. And also, I mean, he played, as I mentioned earlier, very friendly with Weizmann, very important in the foundation of Israel. But also, you know, he died on a mission. So I think Cazalet is fascinating because the Cazalet of 1939 is a very different man from the Cazalet of 1933.
I must say
Indeed.
that my favourite glamour boy is the only female glamour boy. Her title is the Duchess of Argyll. I think just an absolutely fascinating character, not just because I'm a queer woman, obviously, but I do think she's absolutely fascinating. Barbara Cartland being my second favourite glamour boy that wasn't a glamour boy. But I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about the Duchess of Argyll? I mean, I believe her nickname was the Red Duchess, and she seemed to have had a fascinating life before, during, and after the period of the glamour boys.
Well, I can't tell you much more about her, but since writing the book, I've come across another bit of the story which I didn't have access to at the time, which is that you may recall Rob Bernays is very friendly with Walter Elliott, who is a government minister. He's his boss. Eventually, after the war, he became Secretary of State. He became Secretary of State for Scotland, and was quite a significant figure. Walter Elliott was married to Kay Elliott, who was one of the Tennant sisters, three really powerful, intelligent, witty, sassy women from a wealthy background, conservative wealthy background in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. Now, Kay is a fascinating figure. I'm almost certain that they were both, well, I'm told now that certainly Walter was gay, and that Kay was gay as well. And there is probably a biography to be written of the three Tennant sisters, because they're fascinating.
Can I quickly mention, Liz?
And I think that it was a happy marriage.
The other person, quickly, I just want to mention,
it was a happy marriage, but apparently,
there's another rather heroic figure in the book who, I mean, his story has been the subject of a biography and a kind of terrible story, really, which is Leslie Hall Belisha. I mean, that's a very important government minister, and I think that the thing that in the book, he was Jewish and he was treated very badly by Chamberlain, and particularly the first story in the book that shocked me was Nancy Astor, basically implying that because he was Jewish, he'd been making money on army contracts. I mean, he's another vivid character who returns again and again and again, and the group realised just what an appalling person Chamberlain appears to be. I mean, this is the thing that really, I mean, there's been an attempt in recent years, Chris, to rehabilitate Chamberlain's reputation. I think your book has kind of demolished that attempt.
Yes, I mean, he waged a deliberate war, and all the anti-Semitism that is in the magazine Truth, which Joseph Ball put in there, he put in there at Neville Chamberlain's express understanding. It was all coordinated on Neville Chamberlain's behalf. So I have very little sympathy with those who want to rehabilitate Neville Chamberlain at all, I'm afraid. And anyway, I mean, I'm a Labour MP. The fact that Neville Chamberlain endlessly tried to goad the Labour Party just at the time when Britain needed a uniting Prime Minister, not a dividing one, I think is a failure of, is a massive political failure at the time. And in a way, it was by chance that Churchill ended up by becoming the Prime Minister in 1940. But it was because Labour was prepared to work with him that we were able to have a successful prosecution of the war. Hor Belisha, fascinating figure. My working assumption, I didn't put it in the book, but my working assumption is that he was gay. He married, but he married very late. Now, whether that makes him bisexual or whatever, I don't know. But in my terms, queer or nearly queer, I think. Which makes his, challenging of the establishment in the British Army all the more courageous, I think.
Mm-hmm. So we're just wrapping up, but sort of one last question, which I think actually works quite well in terms of gathering together our final thoughts, which is, were these men ever recognised for their diligence and hard work? This is a question from Samina again. As they risk their lives, they're obviously not around, unlike Churchill, to write their sort of histories or their version of the history. But I mean, your book is obviously very much part of that. But are there any other forms of recognition, or maybe closer to the time?
Well, they all get a bit of a mention in other histories, but it's normally as a footnote, and often, for instance, in Jack McNamara's case, an inaccurate footnote. It says he was a member of the pro-Nazi Anglo-German Fellowship, and he wasn't. I've been through all the membership lists. There are 4 in existence, and he's not in any of them, and they would definitely have included him because he was an MP. So they get mentions, but not as much as I think they should. It feels as if the whole effort to oppose appeasement is led by Anthony Eden and by Winston Churchill, whereas in actual fact, I think these people were the glue that kept that group together and gave Eden and Churchill the platform that they needed. And sometimes when they're written about, it's their sexuality is completely ignored or seemed to be irrelevant. But my argument is that it was actually an integral part of what they did for 2 reasons. One, because they had friends in Germany who were arrested, tortured, imprisoned, killed, either as gay men or as Jews. And secondly, because they knew that there was in a sense, they were already outside the mainstream of public opinion because of their sexuality. Not that that's a word that they would have understood, but and they therefore didn't find it too difficult to swim outside the mainstream. So I think that their sexuality was intrinsic to their bravery, not despite it.
Thank you very much. And that's all we've got time for. We could have gone, as you can, I think it's very clearly obvious. Both myself and Ian are just absolutely fascinated by this incredibly well book written and very vivid book. But we could have gone on for hours and hours. But people who enjoy this talk can find out more. Obviously, they can get a copy of the book. So you can do that by following the link in the description below. A huge thank you for the excellent questions sent in by all of you at home, and a huge thanks to Ian and our guest Chris Bryant MP. It's been fascinating talking to you. So we can't leave you without a heads up that we have our next big online event coming in exactly a week from now. This is the opening event of our Climate Talks series, exploring the crucial issue of climate change and how to tackle it. In our first event on Thursday, the 28th of January, Hannah Fry is joined by a panel of experts, including the legend that is Dr. Jane Goodall, to ask the question, why should we care about climate change? To book a free ticket, visit the Science Museum website or the website for any of the museums in the Science Museum group. And that really is all we have time for. So thanks for joining. Enjoy your evening and good night.